Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk about the fallout of the failed military coup that Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group attempted against Russia. Russia have been utilising Wagner's mercenary forces since 2014, and as well as deploying tens of thousands of operatives in Ukraine, they've also got thousands of military personnel all across the Middle East and Africa. So one of the big questions now is what is going to happen in all of those countries? But in addition to the direct military fallout, there is also a major economic fallout of this failed civil war attempt. As I'm sure you'll be perfectly aware, Russia and China have developed strong trading relations over the course of the last 18 months and recently declared a no-limits partnership. However, the Chinese authorities have become increasingly concerned about the political turmoil in Russia, and this civil war attempt now has the potential to severely damage the Russian economy. So in today's video, I'll have a look at the potential damage on the relationship with China. I'll give you an update on what's happening with Yevgeny Prigozhin. We'll have a look at the existing Wagner operations around the world and talk about exactly what's likely to happen, because Wagner are representing Russia in all of the countries that they are present in. I'll give you some details on some additional sanctions that have been applied by the USA as a result of the civil war attempt. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of the fallout of this military coup attempt is for both Russia and the Russian economy.
Saturday's short-lived mutiny by Wagner in Russia may have been an eye-opener for Beijing. It was the biggest test of Vladimir Putin's leadership since his February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And though it quickly faded, analysts in China have been left asking this question: has China wedged itself too closely to Russia? China is Russia's top trading partner and closest ally. At the heart of their relations is a shared opposition to what they see as a world dominated by the United States, and the expansion of the NATO military alliance that threatens their security. But the weekend uprising has unsettled Beijing's leadership, according to a top U.S. official on Monday. Moritz Rudolph of Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center.
So this is something that for the Chinese side, this is of great concern, because they have huge interests in upholding stable and predictable relations with Russia. They have economic interests, they have political interests, and they want to cooperate with Russia at the, for instance, in regional forums and at the multilateral level.
While Chinese state-run media cheered Putin's swift efforts to stamp out the rebellion, even some in China, where critical speech is tightly controlled, have started to question Beijing's bet on Russia.
So a stable Russia is really important for China, and now they saw that Putin might not be as stable as it appeared.
Wen T-sung is a political scientist at the Australian National University.
I think she likely still prefers Putin to the alternatives in Russian politics, but Beijing now has more reasons to have more reservations and to become more transactional in its dealings with Putin's Russia.
It's been reported that as the news broke on Saturday that the mercenary group Wagner were heading towards Moscow, several businessmen from southern China began frantically calling factories to halt shipments of goods that were destined for Russia. While the mutiny, which was the biggest test of Russian President Vladimir Putin's leadership since his February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, quickly faded, some of these exporters are now left questioning their future dependence on Beijing's closest ally. A top US official says that the weekend uprising has unsettled Beijing's cloistered leadership, and some analysts inside and outside China have started to question whether Beijing needs to ease off on its political and economic ties with Moscow. It has put a fly in the ointment of that no-limits relationship, said Singapore-based security analyst Alexander Neil. China will be more cautious with its words and actions about Russia, said Shanghai-based international relations Sheng Dingley. Yang Jun, a professor at Beijing's China University of Political Science and Law, wrote a commentary published on Saturday that called for China to directly support Ukraine to avoid being dragged into a quagmire of war by Russia. With the development of the current situation and the trend of the war, China should further adjust its position on Russia and Ukraine, make its attitude clearer, and decisively stand on the side of the victors of history, he wrote in a Chinese-language Singaporean newspaper. China is Russia's top trading partner, with Beijing exporting everything from automobiles to smartphones, and in return it receives cheap Russian crude oil. But even in the energy sector, which fueled a 40% jump in trade between Russia and China in the first 5 months of 2023, there are some signs of caution. Should Russia lose the war or see changes in the domestic leadership, it will create huge uncertainties for Chinese investors, said Michael Meaden, head of China Energy Research at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. He said the Chinese government also seemed to be exercising caution, pointing out that Beijing had not yet signed a deal for a major new gas pipeline connecting the countries despite a push from Moscow. While China is vital to Russia's economy, China's trade with the likes of the United States, the European Union and Japan, among the fiercest critics of Moscow's war in Ukraine, dwarfs its dealings with Russia. Beijing now has more reasons to have more reservations and to become more transactional in its dealings with Putin's Russia, said Weng T-sung, a political scientist at the Australian National University. There's no point making long-term investment in someone who may not credibly survive into the long term.
Wagner's forces occupied Russia's military headquarters in Rostov-on-Don early on Saturday. The group claimed to have shot down a Russian military helicopter. Pictures also emerged of almost 200 Russian troops surrendering to Wagner. Video of the mercenaries on the streets of the city in southern Russia immediately flooded social media, some mercenaries even finding the time to order fast food. It wasn't long before Russia's president was addressing the nation and vowing retribution.
We will protect our people and our statehood from any threats, including internal betrayal. And what we are facing is betrayal. Exorbitant ambitions and personal interests led to treason.
The Russian leader spelling out just how serious he thinks the threat from Wagner is.
Any internal turmoil is a deadly threat to our statehood, to us as a nation. This is a blow to Russia, to our people.
Russia's defense ministry appealed to Wagner fighters to abandon Prigozhin, saying they'd been tricked into what was described as their leader's criminal adventure and participation in an armed rebellion. Tension between Wagner and the Kremlin's armed forces escalated during the Battle of Bakhmut, where the mercenaries played a crucial role in the drawn-out fight to capture the city. Prigozhin accused the Russian army commanders of deliberately withholding ammunition and other supplies from his men. In an audio recording, Prigozhin denied Putin's accusation of treason.
We are patriots of our homeland. We had been fighting and we are fighting now. No one is going to turn themselves in on demand of the president, FSB, or anyone else, because we do not want any more of our country to live in corruption, lies, and bureaucracy. This is why we are the patriots, and those who are against us are the ones surrounding the scumbags.
Police raided Wagner's headquarters in St. Petersburg, while in Moscow, security has been tightened and what's described as a counter-terrorism state of emergency imposed.
On June the 24th, Russian mercenary fighters from the Wagner Group took control of Rostov-on-Don, one of Russia's largest cities, and were making their way to Moscow. Prigozhin said his men crossed the border from Ukraine into Russia and were ready to go all the way against the Russian military. Prigozhin said his fighters had captured the army headquarters in Rostov-on-Don without firing a single shot and claimed to have the support of the locals. Putin described the actions as an act of treason. In response to this, Russian military helicopters opened fire on a convoy of rebel mercenaries, already more than halfway to Moscow in a lightning advance, and Russian soldiers were reported to have set up machine gun positions on the southwest edge of Moscow. Wagner mercenaries were promised an amnesty if they laid down their weapons, and following a series of negotiations, Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko announced that he had brokered a deal with Prigozhin, who'd agreed to de-escalate the situation. Following this, Prigozhin and the Wagner fighters vacated Russia's military headquarters in Rostov-on-Don, and it was agreed that Prigozhin will now go and live in Belarus and no charges will be brought against him. Wagner fighters who did not participate in the march on Moscow have been offered military contracts by the Russian army. Prigozhin has now stated that in 24 hours we got within 200 kilometers of Moscow. In this time we did not spill a single drop of our fighters' blood. Understanding that Russian blood will be spilled, we are turning our columns around and going back to field camps as planned.
The Wagner Group started in 2014 as a secret arm of Russian intelligence. Originally made up of former Special Forces soldiers, the group was first deployed to Ukraine in 2014 during Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. Then to Syria, where Russia supports President Bashar al-Assad's government. Wagner serves as Russia's military proxy in far-flung areas of the world. Before the recent fighting in Ukraine, Wagner left Russian footprints across Africa, spreading Moscow's influence and feeding instability. Researchers say there are thousands of Wagner mercenaries in about a dozen countries. It has links to the ongoing conflict in Sudan. The U.S. said it gave weapons to Sudan's paramilitary faction. It has also fueled the civil war in the Central African Republic and aided the anti-Western pro-Russian military junta in Mali, accused of war crimes. The Kremlin uses Wagner as a tool, says New America's Candace Rondeau.
They're really important for Putin in terms of diverting attention away from Russian activities in places where they're not supposed to be operating. They fulfill the role of circumventing sanctions, and they turn to the Wagner Group as the kind of enforcer and sort of mercenary service provider, and in exchange they get gold, diamonds, oil, gas, things that are exportable and that can be turned into hard dollars, hard cash, which is extremely important for Russia.
The war in Ukraine helped Prigozhin bring the Wagner Group out of the shadows and grow it into a private military empire.
So one of the big questions currently outstanding is what is going to happen to all of the Wagner troops that are currently deployed all across the Middle East and Africa representing Russia. Following the breakdown of the civil war, President Putin announced that all Wagner troops that were not involved in the uprising would be offered contracts by the Russian army. However, this situation may not sit that well with some of the countries that are currently hosting Wagner troops. If Wagner forces are absorbed into the Russian military overnight, it could be a problem. Many of the countries didn't sign up for a Russian military presence when they asked for Wagner forces, a senior US official stated. Some of those African leaders worry deeply about internal rivals, and Wagner's march on Moscow could fuel their fears. Although not officially part of Russia's military, the Wagner Group is important to Putin because it can promote his foreign policy priorities and reach at a fraction of the cost. And Putin said recently that the group had been fully financed from the state budget, and it's reported that Wagner had been paid more than $2 billion. Earlier this week, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told Russian media that Wagner's work in Central African Republic would continue. Michael Mulroy, a senior Pentagon official, agreed that the weekend's events could harm Wagner in Africa. They will be seen as too unstable and potentially a threat to the leadership in those countries, he said. They almost started a coup in their own country. However, despite the obvious risks to Prigozhin's organisation, there is also a chance that the group could benefit from its mutiny. Wagner's surprise push to Moscow, which faced little resistance, could boost its reputation, leading to more business in Africa. Prigozhin deals in matters of violence, and this could be good news for the brand. The United States has taken aim at Russia's Wagner Group and imposed sanctions on companies it accused of engaging in illicit gold dealings to fund the mercenary force. The US Treasury Department has slapped sanctions on 4 companies in the United Arab Emirates, Central African Republic and Russia, it accused of being connected to the Wagner Group and its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. The companies engaged in illicit gold dealings to fund the militia to sustain and expand its armed forces, including in Ukraine and some countries in Africa, the Treasury said. The Wagner Group funds its brutal operations in part by exploiting natural resources in countries like Central African Republic and Mali, the Treasury's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, Brian Nelson, said in a statement. The United States will continue to target the Wagner Group's revenue streams to degrade its expansion and violence in Africa, Ukraine and anywhere else. Wagner, whose men in Ukraine include thousands of ex-prisoners recruited from Russian jails, has grown into a sprawling international business with mining interests and fighters in Africa and the Middle East. The companies hit with sanctions include Central African Republic-based Midas Resources and Dianville, Dubai-based Industrial Resources General Trading, and Russia-based Limited Liability Company. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video really to give you an update on the situation in Russia following Wagner's failed military coup. Throughout the war in Ukraine, Yevgeny Prigozhin's profile has risen, and he's become more and more controversial, often posting videos onto Telegram complaining about the support that he was receiving from the Russian authorities. However, the attempted military coup that took place on the 24th of June took everybody by surprise. Nobody was expecting Wagner to turn back from Ukraine and head towards Moscow. Now, in the context of world history, this civil war was very short-lived, less than 24 hours. So it's not going to go down in the history books. But I think it does highlight a number of issues. Firstly, it gives us an indication as to what life at the front line is like for Russian forces. Wagner have been used as the spearhead by the Russian army. They are in the thick of it in terms of all of the fighting. And clearly, over the course of the last 12 months, that situation has got more and more desperate, and ultimately Yevgeny Prigozhin decided that he didn't want his troops to continue in that fight and that he could no longer support their activities. And I think that is a really telling sign that Russia's war effort could be waning. But I think the other clear and obvious message that's coming through from what's happened is that Yevgeny Prigozhin was not happy with the orders that he was receiving directly from Russia. And as a result of that, he decided to rebel. And this really gives us an indication as to the level of feeling amongst the Russian troops. We are not seeing a united force. Not everybody is standing behind the idea as to why Russia has invaded Ukraine. So clearly cracks are starting to show in terms of the military effort. But in terms of this video today, what I wanted to talk about was the potential economic impact on the Russian economy. And what we've seen in today's video is that Russia's biggest trading partner, China, is very concerned about what's happening with the political situation in Russia. The events of the last week or so have definitely unsettled Chinese businesses and Chinese investors. And so we may see an element of caution in terms of that trading relationship over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. Now, China is obviously a very pragmatic country. It wants to sell as many products as it can globally. And Russia is an important trading partner for China, but it only represents a very small amount of total Chinese exports. And in a worst-case scenario, China could live without the revenue that it earns from selling to Russia. However, when you look at the situation from Russia's perspective, it's very different. Russia is becoming more and more dependent on the oil exports that it's selling directly to China, and it's also dependent on China for a lot of its imports. So President Putin and the Russian authorities will be doing everything within their powers over the course of the next few weeks to try to suppress all of the concerns that are now rising in China, because Russia desperately needs that relationship with China both to continue and to expand. And I think what we're seeing here is that the balance of power in that relationship lies entirely with China, as Russia needs China far more than China needs Russia. So the overall summary of today's video is that the Wagner uprising is bad news for Russia. It's bad news from a military perspective because it shows that there are major problems on the front line. Russia now also has a problem in so much as Wagner has been leading the charge in all of its battles, and there are now major question marks over the future of the Wagner Group. There are also military implications in terms of Russia's positions in a lot of other countries in the Middle East and Africa, where it's using Wagner troops to represent its interests. But over and above the military concerns, there are now major economic concerns. The failed military coup attempt by the Wagner Group has definitely destabilized the political situation in Russia and made a lot of its trading partners take a step back and think about what could happen if President Putin was overthrown, if somebody else decided to take over the country. And from a Chinese perspective, there are now rising concerns as to the future stability of that trading relationship, which means that there is now a possibility that Russia could see a fall in the level of trade with China, which would be absolutely devastating for the Russian economy, because Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China, whereas China simply doesn't have that same level of dependency and can decide to do business with other countries if it wants to. So the bottom line from today's video is that the recent uprising by Wagner, although it was stopped very quickly and didn't proceed to a full-scale civil war, has been very damaging to Russia and its economy. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments on this and any other related stories. Hopefully you found today's video useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.